Well, it turns out Luke Miani hit it out of the park, and I have a whole lot less trust in the Mac rumor source because pretty much everything that Luke talked about yesterday ended up happening, and then some. A few disappointments, but a lot of surprises, and a lot of things I was very happy to see. This is primarily going to be all about why the Mac Studio is the coolest Mac ever. Let's begin. I guess, similar to Apple, we should get the boring stuff out of the way first. The iPhone SE, pretty much like clockwork, has 5G now. There's new color options that aren't really that new. It's just midnight and starlight instead of black and white. Okay, it's got 5G, it's got the A15 chip. That allows for smart HDR4 and I guess slightly better video recording, but the more important thing is that they have actually, allegedly, physically increased the battery capacity on the inside to account for 5G. So, at least comparing the new iPhone SE3 to other iPhones in the lineup, you should expect the battery life on the SE3 to be on par with the iPhone 12 mini, which a lot of people had issues with, but I think for the lower starting price, people are going to be more okay with it. But that got an increase, by the way. iPhone SE3 starts at $429 instead of $399, so I guess that's just inflation doing its work on the iPhone SE. No changes to the storage options, although they did revive the 256 gig tier, which was originally with the SE2. I'm glad the battery life has improved, but it's still not going to be as good as even the iPhone 13 mini. But I was really worried there for a minute that, you know, you were just going to add 5G and the battery was going to be even worse because of it. Thanks to the A15 chip being more power efficient and the fact that they said that they've physically increased the capacity, I think that it should be better than it was on the SE2. The other somewhat interesting thing was the iPad Air 5, which now, of course, finally has center stage and 5G, but kind of pulling a quick one on everyone, Apple threw in the M1 chip. We were all expecting A15 and they were like, no, we want more overkill performance in the iPad line. So I personally think the M1 chip is unnecessary in the iPad Pro line, and I personally also think it's unnecessary in the iPad Air, but there's still enough differences, in my opinion, between the 11-inch Pro and the 10.9-inch Air that I don't think it's going to cannibalize anything. I mean, there will probably be new refreshed iPad Pros in 6 months. Plus, the main reason people go with an iPad Pro is usually because of Face ID, 120 Hertz, or the better cameras, or LiDAR, or Thunderbolt, or the larger size option with mini LED and that kind of stuff. So I don't think the fact that the iPad Pro and iPad Air have the same silicon is really going to mess that much up, especially considering the iPad Air 5 still has 64 gigs by default. The price didn't change, which is good. It's still $599, but the fact that they're making M1 chips coupled with 64 gigs of storage, that's never happened before. That's new. And even that, they're non-binned M1 chips. Like, they still have 8 GPU cores. They're not the 7-core GPUs of like the entry-level MacBook Air. So it's like a fairly high-end version of the M1, just coupling it with small storage and putting it in a $600 iPad is kind of interesting. But yeah, for those of you who just may by chance be using LumaFusion all the time with your iPad and will appreciate those faster speeds, I guess now there's an option for you. But of course, also there's purple and like a muted blue. There's just a little bit more variety with the colors now. Still not really feeling it. I prefer my iPad Pro and I like 120 Hertz, so I'm not gonna say the Air 5 is worth it over a certified refurbished 2018 iPad Pro, but if you don't care about 120 Hertz or Face ID and you need it to be new or colorful from Apple for whatever reason, yes, now you have a pretty decent option. They also introduced 2 new colors for the iPhone 13 lineup. We had been hearing that the regular 13 and 13 mini were gonna get a green option, but I was very surprised to see Apple bring in this like alpine green color for the Pro series. That kind of caught me off guard. I was just thinking it was going to be for the entry iPhone. So very happy that there are more color options out there. They're not really for me, but happy that they exist. But let's talk about the real meat of this show. Apple bringing the Studio naming to the Mac line. And personally, I think this is like one of the coolest Macs Apple has ever come up with in recent history, because the Mac Studio doesn't really fit into any previous category we've seen in the past few years. It's this perfect space, in my opinion, between the Mac Mini and the Mac Pro, which I think are a little bit too underclocked or underperforming on one end and a little bit too overclocked and overperforming on the other. Now, starting at $2,000, we have this mid-tier box, which is just a little bit bigger than a Mac Mini, but it starts with an M1 Max chip. This is a big deal for me because before, the cheapest way to get the M1 Max was in a MacBook Pro, 14 inches, and it basically had to be over $3,000. Now, the fact that you can access the insane performance of that chip in a $2,000 $2,000 tower is just mind-boggling. Like, no other PC of that size or really that close to that price point is going to be as efficient and as fast with the GPU cores, and not to mention have Thunderbolt options so plentiful. The I/O is fantastic on the Mac Studio. 4 Thunderbolt ports on the back with 10 gigabit Ethernet, still HDMI 2.0, which is a bit of a bummer, but the headphone jack, which of course is still supporting high-end audio speakers, not to mention SD card slot and 2 more USB-C ports on the front. And for your legacy cables, you still got 2 USB-A on the back. Like, this is iMac Pro levels of connectivity. And with the M1 Max version of the Mac Studio, they're just regular USB-C ports on the front, but still, 4 Thunderbolt ports on the back of the Mac Studio is more Thunderbolt ports than we've ever seen on any Apple Silicon before, which is great, meaning you could plug in like a ton of Pro displays and a 4K TV at the same time. But it gets even better if you opt for a brand new chip that I just have to mention. I called it before. I got a lot of things wrong. I was predicting the Mac Studio thing wouldn't be right. But back last year, I made a video predicting that Apple was going to make the M1 Ultra. That ended up being the exact naming they chose with, which resulted in basically the suspicion many people were having, which was that the M1 Max has these ways of stitching to other chips if they want to daisy chain them fairly easily. So Apple has figured out a way to attach multiple Apple Silicon chips to each other and basically combine this performance power, which means the M1 Ultra is 2 M1 Maxes put together, which, yes, that means 16 high performance cores, 4 efficiency cores, and 64 GPU cores, 32 neural cores. Like, it's an insane amount of performance. The M1 Max was already like industry leading and shattering all these records. Now the M1 Ultra is actually performing similarly to an RTX 3090 and consuming like 100 watts less power. What's crazy is to think this isn't even the end of Apple Silicon, like it could keep going even further. But yeah, that chip, as powerful as it is and how fast as it can be, it is actually going to end up costing quite a bit. So $2,000 for the M1 Max is awesome, but once you get into M1 Ultra territory, since you're paying for 2 M1 Maxes, it's basically twice the price. The cheapest M1 Ultra is $4,000, but the good news is all M1 Ultras come with 1 terabyte of storage by default. So if 1 terabyte is enough, you might not have to spend that much more. But I should also mention the cheapest M1 Ultra for $4,000 is binned. It's a 48 core GPU instead of 64. And if you want a non-binned version of the M1 Ultra, they add on another $1,000 on top of that, meaning it's $5,000 to get, you know, a fully unlocked M1 Ultra. And that starts with 64 gigs of RAM, but you can still opt for 128 gigs. And keep in mind, that's unified memory. So this is not traditional RAM. 128 gigs of unified memory is a lot. But what I found interesting about Apple doubling up on performance with like basically 2 M1 Maxes stitched together, that allows for double the RAM and double the CPU, double the GPU. In terms of storage though, they didn't want to budge. It still maxes out at 8 terabytes. Most people probably don't need 16 terabytes of local storage, but I would also make the argument most people don't need 16 high performance cores. So if someone wants to get crazy with speccing out their Mac Studio, I think they should be able to, but I guess 8 terabytes is enough. I mean, I haven't filled up mine yet, so I'm one to talk, but thanks to having 2 M1 Maxes in the M1 Ultra, the 2 USB-C ports on the front of the Mac Studio are actually Thunderbolt if you're willing to shell out that extra cash. So if you spend $4,000 or more on the Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra, basically you're getting 6 Thunderbolt 4 ports on a single device. That is just insane for Apple Silicon and gives you access to all kinds of additional hardware. Apple said that they cared about modularity with this thing, but I don't think that means opening it up and adding things to the inside. It was primarily just about you can plug in a bunch of extra accessories. Like, I have never seen 6 Thunderbolt ports on a machine this small. I think the Mac Pro may have come close to that, but again, that started at $6,000 and came with 256 gigs of storage. And of course, could be spec'd up to $40,000-$50,000. And the funny thing about that is Apple compared the M1 Ultra to the fastest CPU you could get in a Mac Pro and the best GPU you could get, and M1 Ultra beats it by quite a large margin. It's like 60 to 90% faster than the most expensive Mac Pro possible. So they even teased at the very end of the event, which I thought was awesome. They were like, and the Mac Pro is coming later. So they admit, like, this is the last step and it's for another day. But honestly, even though they haven't refreshed it yet, I'm just like, why is the Mac Pro still on the website? Like, that thing is far more expensive than the Mac Studio, and it doesn't even have an SD card slot. It's much bigger. It's much much less efficient. I guess there's probably someone out there that wants boot camp for some diehard reason or needs Intel for the x86 architecture, but at this point, with M1 Ultra being in existence, I think people should really start realizing to switch over their software. And if you don't start adopting to the ARM architecture and optimizing for Apple Silicon, you're going to be paying a crap ton of money for it, and that's going to kind of suck that you have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars more because, we don't feel like optimizing for ARM. We want to keep using x86. Look at the performance gains we're getting on the M1 Ultra. For a fraction of the price, you can get industry-leading graphics and processing power. So there should be a lot of incentive for software engineers and different third-party companies to switch over their code to the ARM architecture and Apple Silicon optimized as soon as possible. Overall, I think the Mac Studio is the star of the show, but I should of course mention Apple basically rebranded the 27-inch 5K iMac into a studio display. And I haven't seen many people play it that way because, of course, the studio display looks new and looks clean, and I have a lot of thoughts on it, but essentially the panel in the studio display is the exact same panel Apple has been using in all their previous 5K iMacs for years. It's 60 hertz, which is kind of a deal breaker for me. It's just an LCD, there's no mini LED, and it peaks out at around 500 nits, and it's not like an HDR certified display. It still supports a decent number of colors, and I'm not saying the 5K iMac displays were bad, but there's just not much new display specifications to talk about. Pretty much every other aspect of the monitor has been improved. There is a center stage camera, 12 megapixel ultra wide, which I love. Thank you, Apple, for bringing that to the external monitor business, and tons of speakers baked into the bottom of this thing. See, guys? It's possible to have speakers and not have a chin. Although there's no chin, it's actually a bit thicker bezel than the Pro Display XDR, likely to accommodate for that webcam and the speakers, and also the studio quality microphones they baked into this thing. It has an A13 chip on the inside, which is basically just being used as the image signal processor. Like, it helps them manage center stage, and it helps them make sure the content looks good and with voice isolation and all that, and that's pretty much all it does. I was thinking with the A13 chip in there, they would have a mode where you could turn it into a Apple TV, because tvOS is currently running on an A12 chip, so switching it to A13 should be even better. Or if there was going to be some like low latency AirPlay features with it, but no, not even that. It's just A13 chip for webcam and speakers and microphones. That's pretty much all it's there for. It has 3 additional USB-C ports on the back, and it comes with a charging capable Thunderbolt port, which I love, which means if you are interested in the studio display, it'll come with that cable, which I think is braided, and you plug it into the Thunderbolt port on the back and plug that into your MacBook Pro. It will charge the MacBook Pro, so you don't even have to use the braided MagSafe that your MacBook Pro came with. That becomes useless very quickly, but one port to do up to 96 watts of power and have a 5K signal at 60 hertz, which is pretty dang impressive. I like everything about the monitor other than the fact that they kept it at 60 hertz, and yes, thank God they're actually including the stand on this one. I think they were getting a little bit tired of the Pro Stand memes, and they were just about ready to move on from that, so there's like a 24-inch iMac looking stand, and there's also, for only $400 more, a height and tilt adjustable stand. So I found that interesting. It's soldered into the monitor itself, so it's not like interchangeable like the Pro Stand is, but it basically works the same way the Pro Stand does. And of course, you can still opt for the VESA mount kit if you're planning on mounting it to something. That doesn't lower the price at all. It's still $1,600 regardless, but I would say, considering it's only $300 more to get nano textured glass instead of the traditional glossy, these are some of the lowest prices we've seen for an Apple standalone monitor in a long time. We've gotten so accustomed to the $6,000 Pro display and the $1,000 stand over the past couple years. It's very refreshing to see Apple making a standalone monitor under $2,000 again. Sure, it would have been nice if it was $1,000, but I think with inflation the way it is, it's probably just unrealistic to assume that's possible. But the fact that you get so much with that external monitor, like, I really wanted center stage on my MacBook Pro, but now if I dock it with the studio display, I kind of get that feature back. It just comes at the cost of no mini LED and 60 hertz, which isn't gonna bother most people, but that personally might bother me a lot because I was just so happy with how the display panel was was on my MacBook Pro, and the fact that Apple is now selling a solution, but you have to compromise still on your dynamic range and your refresh rate if you want an external monitor. I was hoping the bezels along the border could be a tad thinner, but that's not really the major issue. Either way, I'm very excited to check them out. I have ordered the Mac Studio and Studio Display. I'm not planning on necessarily keeping them forever, but just like reviewing them for the channel and letting you guys know my thoughts on how they look and feel. But it's cool to think at a spring event, Apple launched M1 Ultra, and basically the most powerful Mac ever. It beats out every configuration of the cheese grater Mac Pro, and in the next couple months, hopefully, we'll see Apple daisy chain 4 M1 Maxes together, and that's when you could maybe start seeing 256 gigs of RAM and 128 GPU cores, and that will likely be a larger machine, and I'm guessing not that modular, but knowing that the Mac Studio is not like fully unlocked is quite interesting, and the fact that they advocated as to why this is a much better Mac than the 27-inch iMac, which is also removed from the site. They're no longer selling any Intel iMacs at this point. The only Intel Macs on the website are the Space Gray Mac Mini, which is using very, very old Intel processors, which aren't even being built anymore, so I have the feeling they just have a bunch of those stockpiled in a warehouse, and they're just trying to get rid of them. And of course, the cheese grater Mac Pro, which they already referenced at this event, is next up. Like, that's what their next focus is going to be for Apple Silicon. So this is a really exciting time. I don't know what they're going to brand that chip. It's cool to see Apple finally embracing the Ultra naming. Like, there's something ahead of Macs. Do we get iPhone Ultra, iPad Ultra, MacBook Ultra now? But yeah, they made it fairly clear that this new chip pretty much is optimized for desktops and probably won't be seen on laptops anytime soon. I'm still very happy with the MacBook Pro I have. It's plenty fast for my needs, but knowing there's a faster one on the way does get me a little bit excited, and should be lots of fun unboxings to enjoy. Oh, that reminds me. They actually are now letting people order a Touch ID equipped black Magic keyboard with a silver aluminum body. Same thing with a black Magic trackpad, black Magic mouse with silver aluminum. That used to only come with the $6,000 Mac Pro. Now you can get it separately, which is good because the Mac Studio, unfortunately, does not come with a keyboard or mouse. So you might want to just provide your own if you don't feel like spending the $200. But overall, I thought the pacing of this event was fantastic, and I thought it was fairly rich with new information. It's cool to see a brand new product category, new colors, spec upgrades, and also breaking new milestones with Apple Silicon. It was a well-rounded keynote. There was a little bit of Apple TV Plus at the beginning, but not too much fluff. I kind of just expect that from Apple now. So I want to hear what you guys are most excited for. What do you think the best part of this event was? How much faster do you think Apple's going to get with the Mac Pro? And how many of you think the Mac Studio is going to be the perfect YouTube content creating machine? All that good stuff. Let me know what you're thinking down below. This is your Apple Sheep here. We'll see you all in the next one.